So I want to start off by just thanking people. One, just for subscribing and checking out these weird videos that I do, but also giving me so many interesting suggestions, books, and actually even movies. And so I had this one suggestion of Employee of the Month and checked it out. And it was really pretty good. And it reminded me of Office Space. And then I realized there's kind of a whole genre of these movies that kind of make fun of work. Um, Superstore, and there's probably half a dozen more that I've missed. And I wonder why we make fun of these. And at the same time, work is it's one of the main stressors. If you ask people, what's stressing you out right now? I mean, work will almost always top the list. And I was kind of thinking about this, and all of a sudden, got all this stuff from my work where I had to do some paperwork, and all of a sudden, I'm doing a video on this. It's just more of a synchronicity that I can handle. So I'm going to start off with a quote. This is Patricia Alexander, who is a psychologist, and and then I'll talk about this thing in cognitive psychology called schemas, and then I'll try to go back to Office Space and Employee of the Month and try to put it together for you. So this is the quote. So without the ability to discern meaningful patterns in the stream of data that continually flood the senses, humans would remain prisoners within a world of isolated sights, smells, and sounds, unable to comprehend or to build on experiences across time and space. So I find that really interesting because in that view, which represents so much of what's going on in cognitive psychology, we would, if we didn't have the ability to abstract across our immediate experience, would be prisoners locked in the here and now. And the funny thing about all that is, if the here and now is a prison, it's a prison that has a lot of people banging on the doors to get into, with mindfulness being such a popular movement right now. Many of us are trying to, turn down the thinking mind, this abstract mind wandering that takes us away from the present moment, and get into this prison of just being in the moment because it's just so free of stress. So this actually started off in cognitive psychology. It comes about in many different ways, but the most basic version of it is called a schema. So a schema is a mental abstraction, kind of a generic version of reality that is supposed to simplify the complexities of the here and now, which is strange too, because those of you who meditate and if you practice mindfulness, sometimes the simplest thing is the here and now, and the most complex thing is our abstraction of it. But anyway, I'm going to give you a real quick example here. So Joe walks into a restaurant, sits down, grabs a menu, and then realizes he needs to go back to his car because he's forgotten something. So what did Joe forget? Well, you probably were able to, or you heard a voice in your head probably said, well, his glasses, because he needs to read the menu. And that's one of the most classic examples of what's called a schema. So we have a kind of a restaurant schema where we just know it's this generic knowledge where we sit down, we read a menu, and you need your glasses if you're going to read the menu. And cognitive makes really not much of a big deal about this. They talk about these schemas, and there's all kinds of schemas where some of them are related to time, some of them are related to people, and it's pretty obvious that we spend a lot of our time living in these abstract schemas compared to the real world. The mind has left reality and has entered this place of our abstract kind of generic characterization, caricature. I guess that's a better way to put it. It's like, when you draw this cartoon exaggeration of reality, because, well, it probably helped our ancestors in some ways, and I've gone into that in other videos. But right now, it really, it still could be a useful tool if we know when to use it, but these are not worlds that a lot of us want to live in. So there's a huge movement now where we want to get out of the abstract, out of thinking all the time, and just get back to, what Patricia talked about as a prison, but what many of us see as this state of peace and tranquility, the here and the now. And so how does this relate to these movies that make fun of work? Well, if you've seen Office Space, which was a classic in the 90s, and I think Employee of the Month was a really good one too, Um, what they're really making fun of is these collective realities, that these abstractions. You know, when you go to work, it's really just this, it's a building with a bunch of people in it. But then when humans and our talent to leave the real and go into these abstract worlds, which is prized by so many cognitive scientists, but there are consequences to it. And I think that's what these movies make fun of, you know, like the stress of a TPS report in Office Space. You know, it's, what is it? It's just some, you know, scribblings on a piece of paper, but it's the collective hallucination, it's the collective abstract agreement that these TPS reports are important, that we create as a reality. So, you know, if one person has a hallucination, well, we say that they're schizophrenic. Well, when a bunch of people collectively hallucinate and say this is Office Space or this is Home Depot, or, you know, then they're fine and they're healthy, even though they're both hallucinations. It's just one is a collective and one is individual. So what about psychedelics? What happens when people have a psychedelic experience, which is really being investigated in a very scientific way right now? Well, one possibility is that this collective abstract hallucination is seen for what it is, and you realize that it's just a story, it's fiction, and so it could be really sort of comical. Now, again, you don't even need psychedelics, because I think the reason we find these movies funny is because all of us, we have a part of us. There's some element, some sense in which we all realize these collective hallucinations. And even though we simultaneously might get stressed out about them, we realize that they're based on just a collective hallucination. And that's why I think we watch them and find it to be funny. So, a lot to kind of digest in 7 minutes, but just curious what you think about work. You know, is work real? What is real? We've had this tendency to leave the real world, the concrete world of physical, and people criticize materialists sometimes, but you know, the material world can be a fantastic place if it's devoid of thinking, and we really get into the material world. That's why people who live, you know, you could have a quote simple life, and some of them can be very, very, you know, happy because they spend so much time in the real world. And those of us who leave that, especially academics, and they get into these abstractions, and there's a lot of stress to be found in these abstractions, even though I think part of us realizes that's, well, nonsense.